James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. The few months which I spent with the 2nd Battalion in Glasgow were so extremely barren of incident that I shall pass them over in silence. The regiment quitted the metropolis of the West on the 1st and occupied the castle of Edinburgh on the 3rd of August, 1814. On the 16th of the same month, I, along with 7 officers and 140 men, returned to Glasgow, and from thence went to Greenock to embark for the 1st Battalion in Ireland. On our arrival at the place of embarkation on the 21st, we were not a little astonished to find that the transports had quitted the harbour that morning empty. 3 other detachments marched in on the same day, but the whole were ordered to rejoin their 2nd battalions. We remained in Greenock nearly 3 weeks, to our great personal discomfort and the manifest injury of our purses. An order at length arrived for us to proceed to Glasgow, whence 2 of the officers and all the men returned to Edinburgh, and the rest joined the 1st Battalion, then quartered in Fermoy. In November I returned to Scotland, where I remained until April 1815, when I joined my old companions, then on the eve of embarking for Belgium. Being quite unprepared for such an event, the return of the exile of Elba to France produced varied sensations in the breasts of the members of the British Army. Those who, during the previous contest, had ascended the ladder of promotion at a pace little swifter than that of the snail, viewed the prospect of another interminable contest with no very agreeable feelings. Those who had friends who could give them an additional hitch up the ladder or help them to some snug staff situation were quite delighted on the occasion. A third class, if their assertions could be credited, were more anxious to have a place assigned them within point-blank shot of the enemy's artillery than one far removed from the scene of danger. But who, for a moment, could give credit to such an asseveration? Where is the man who, having a choice of alternatives, would not rather prefer remaining in a place of security with honour than rush into one where the chances are decidedly against his escaping without a severe or a mortal wound? Point him out, and he shall very soon be told that either he possesses the spirit of a demon, or he longs to commit a suicidal crime for nothing but an unquenchable thirst after human blood, or a sincere desire to quit this world. Could make any man prefer a scene of strife and slaughter to one of peace and honourable repose. War, the last remedy for the cure of national complaints, should never be applied until every other has proved ineffectual. It ought never to be undertaken but on just grounds, for those who engage in it from motives of interest or ambition become accountable for all the crimes that are committed, the property destroyed, and the human blood shed during its continuance. Happy would it have been for Napoleon Bonaparte, for France, and for all those countries into which he carried his arms, had he viewed war in this light and considered it more glorious to employ his military talents in defence of his people, and in securing them all the blessings of a lasting peace, than engaging in hazardous enterprises from which he never could have expected any greater reward than a portion of that phantom glory which in all ages has proved the ruin and the death of millions. A conqueror such as Napoleon, who has acquired military renown by the ruin of empires and the death of millions, cannot be compared to anything more aptly than a flood which destroys everything in its course, or to a beast of prey which delights in blood and slaughter. Man, being naturally active and restless, seldom fails, when not usefully employed, to engage in enterprises which but too often injure himself or others. Of this fact Napoleon furnishes us with ample proof. Whenever he had no immediate prospect of advancing his darling object in France, that instant he cast his eye over Europe, selected an antagonist, picked a quarrel with him, put his armies in motion, and then trampled upon the rights and liberties of every nation through which he marched his troops to the scene of action. His towering ambition aimed at nothing less than universal monarchy, to attain which he waded through rivers of blood. For many years, neither rocks, mountains, deserts, seas, nor rivers could check his desolating course. These facts being fresh in the recollection of the Allied sovereigns, the ex-emperor's landing in France was no sooner communicated to them at Vienna than the clang of arms resounded throughout every corner of continental Europe. The trumpet of war again sounded the dreadful note of preparation, and those warriors who, in the previous campaigns, had lent their aid to break the charm of French invincibility were, when almost on the threshold of their peaceful habitations, ordered to retrace their steps without tasting of any of those sweets which a meeting of friends after a long absence never fails to produce. Having previously purchased a comfortable sea stock and supplied ourselves with whatever was necessary for a long campaign on the continent, we left Cork Barracks on the 1st of May, and the same afternoon embarked at Cove. Early on the 3rd, we prepared to depart and were clear of the harbour before midday. Scudding along with a favourable gale, we passed between the rocks of Scilly and the Land's End on the morning of the 5th, looked into Plymouth on the 6th, Portsmouth on the 7th, passed Dungeness on the 8th, and next day dropped anchor 2 miles from Ostend. In the afternoon, a few of the troops were landed, and the rest on the following morning. In the evening of the 10th, we moved along the Ghent Canal in longboats as far as Bruges, where we halted till sunrise on the 11th, when we resumed our voyage and at 8 o'clock in the evening cast anchor at Ghent. The city of Ghent, or Gand, is situated on the Scheldt and at an equal distance from Ostend and Brussels, viz., from 26 to 30 miles. The city possesses a spacious marketplace, which on market days is almost completely covered with the booths of itinerant merchants. Its streets are spacious and clean, but are cut in numerous places by canals, which intersect each other so in various parts of the city that to connect the islands on which the town stands, no fewer than 328 bridges were then necessary. In consequence of this, the city covers an amazing space of ground, nearly double that occupied by the city of Edinburgh, though the population does not amount to half the number of the latter. In every quarter of the town we were treated with great hospitality by the people, who were really angry if we would not consent to live with them. When Louis XVIII found himself compelled by the defection of his troops to leave his native country, he retired in the first instance to Ostend and subsequently to Ghent, where a suitable residence was provided for him by the King of the Netherlands. During our stay in this city, we were afforded repeated opportunities of testifying to the exiled monarch how deeply we sympathized with him on his recent misfortunes. He took a daily airing in a coach and four and was generally accompanied by a detachment of the Garde du Corps. For a few days after we went to Ghent, gentlemen were admitted to the royal presence during dinner, a piece of very ridiculous and troublesome condescension. A guard of British troops went on duty at the temporary palace every day, and the officers dined at one of the tables, where a senior officer of the household troops always presided. At daybreak on the 27th of May, the 28th, 32nd, 42nd, 44th, 79th and 92nd Regiments and 3rd Battalion Rifle Corps marched from Ghent under the command of Colonel Cameron, 92nd to Alost, and next morning continued their route to Brussels. At Alost, a French officer in the suite of Louis XVI, but who had held a commission in the British service for 21 years, informed us that he was present when Marshal Ney bedewed the King's hands with tears on taking leave to bring Bonaparte to Paris in an iron cage. He described the interview as so extremely interesting that not only His Majesty but all who witnessed it were sensibly affected. From that time, the Bourbon adherents were pleased to bestow on the gallant marshal the name which above all others is the most abhorrent to the ear of a Christian: Judas Ney. Brussels, having been described 1,000 times over by pens far abler than mine, I conceive it to be quite unnecessary to enter upon a lengthened eulogy of the fascinating squares, parks, and walks of that celebrated city, and therefore shall proceed to describe the country 16 miles to the south of it, as it appeared to me on the memorable 16th, 17th, and 18th days of June 1815. Before doing so, however, I shall lay before my readers a state showing the distribution of the British and Hanoverian troops on the day preceding the Battle of Quatre-Bras, and also a few particulars illustrative of our proceedings and that of our great leader, from the time that the latter received the first intelligence of Bonaparte's movement across the frontier, down to that hour in which we quitted the capital of Belgium to meet our antagonists on the plains of Quatre-Bras. On the 4th of June, the Duke of Wellington, accompanied by Prince Blucher, reviewed the 5th Division in the vicinity of Brussels. The Prince was lavish of his praise, and the Duke seemed quite delighted on perceiving so many of his old peninsular friends again under his command. On passing the venerable warrior and his more youthful compeer, my attention was completely abstracted from the business in which we were engaged, and riveted on the countenances of the two heroes to whom, above all others, Europe was most indebted for her liberty in 1814. But for the noble stand which the Duke of Wellington made in the Peninsula, the Russian autocrat would never have braved the colossal power of the French ruler, and had Blucher shown less spirit and enterprise, the Allies would not have arrived before the gates of Paris in March 1814. Such being the facts, was there anything unreasonable in us looking forward to the military talents of the Duke and the spirit and enterprise of the Prince producing, in 1815, results similar to those of the previous campaign? I think not. But yet I must confess that our expectations were considerably lowered on a minute examination of the number and quality of the troops composing the hostile armies. The Emperor of France, having recalled to his standard a great proportion of his old soldiery, had many thousands who, just returned from prison in Britain, Russia, etc., were not only ready, but, their natural bravery having been whetted rather than blunted by a residence in a foreign land, were also willing, indeed anxious, to undertake the most hazardous enterprises if directed against their former antagonists. To oppose an army of 140,000 or 150,000 men, to whom danger had long been familiar and spoliation but too long their daily occupation, the two chiefs had under their command a force equally numerous, but not all so efficient in the field. The Prussians were a fine body of men, brave, hardy, and well-disciplined, but not a few of them were militia. The Hanoverians were very young men, and many of the officers were little better than children. The Dutch and the Belgians were fine-looking fellows, but some of the latter had fought too long under the tricolour flag. The British were animated with the best spirit, but their numbers were small, and nearly one half of them had never been in a field of strife. Therefore, although the armies of the Duke of Wellington and Prince Blucher were equally formidable in point of numerical strength, still they were in many other respects greatly inferior to their opponents. With this force, however inferior in physical strength as it was, they had no alternative but to meet the foe should he venture across the frontier. Circumstances, unfortunately, prevented the British general from having the several divisions of his army cantoned so favourably as he could have wished. This, although occasioned by the difficulty experienced by the commissary in finding forage for such a large body of cavalry and baggage animals, has been made the subject of a very grave charge against the field marshal by those who have permitted the necessity of the case to escape their observation. But another and more serious charge has been preferred against the Duke on this occasion, namely, attending a ball given by the Duchess of Richmond, when he should have been engaged in making arrangements for the dreadful meeting between himself and his formidable opponent. Had the latter been preferred by some hare-brained or disappointed person, I should not have considered it necessary to notice it here. But having heard the charge preferred by thousands who actually believed it to be true, and knowing, as I do, the whole to be a malicious fabrication propagated to detract from the honours which the Duke had won on many a bloody field, I trust I may be permitted to state a few facts connected with this subject, which, it is to be hoped, will set the matter at rest in the breasts of those who may do me the honour to look into the pages of this volume. Everything being prepared on the part of the enemy to open the campaign with éclat, Bonaparte quitted Paris on the 12th of June, and on the 14th issued a proclamation to the soldiers, in which, after recalling to their remembrance the deeds of former times, he very candidly told them they had battles to fight and dangers to encounter, but assured them that with steadiness and valour, victory would be theirs. Early on the morning of the 15th of June, the French army crossed the Sambre at various places, and then directed its march upon Charleroi, where General Ziethen, with the First Corps of the Prussian army, was posted. After a smart affair, the latter retired upon Fleurus, the point of assembly, whither they were pursued by the right wing and right of the left wing under Napoleon himself. At a subsequent period of the day, the Prussians retired still farther to Ligny, followed by the enemy. The left of the French army, under Marshal Ney, moved upon the high road to Brussels and drove back a corps of Belgians under the Prince of Weimar, first to the position of Frasne and latterly to Quatre-Bras. At 7 o'clock that evening, Captain H., Lieutenant Gihmat, and myself strolled as far as the park to enjoy our usual promenade. We had scarcely gone halfway down one of the walks when Dr. H., who had dined with the Duke of Wellington, or rather who did so every day, stepped hastily up to Captain H., who was an old acquaintance, and with considerable earnestness requested us to go home and pack up our baggage, as Napoleon was in motion. Being curious, as may be conceived, to know a few more particulars, we pressed the doctor so hard to satisfy our curiosity that he at length informed us that during dinner the Field Marshal received a dispatch from Prince Blucher intimating that he had been attacked. On the cloth being removed, the Duke, filling his glass, called a bumper and then gave as a toast, "Prince Blucher and the Prussian army, and success to them." On paying this mark of respect to his gallant colleague, the Field Marshal rose from the table, retired to his closet, and in a few minutes dispatched the necessary orders to every division of the Allied army. The reader must remember that this was 3 hours before the ball commenced, and 4 before the Marshal entered the ballroom, which he did but for a few minutes, a little after 11 o'clock. But more, the troops in Brussels had not only received orders of readiness, but had received 6 days' bread, and were actually on the streets long before the ball began. All these things, therefore, afford the most convincing proof that the whole story has been fabricated for the worst of purposes, namely, to injure the character of the Duke of Wellington, and by contrast, to raise that of Napoleon. Between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening, the troops in Brussels received orders to be ready to fall in at a moment's notice, and at the same time 6 days' bread and biscuit was issued to each man. This was rather too much, for the soft staff of life was so bulky that few of the men could stow the whole of it away. In many instances, therefore, the bread was either left in the street or with those on whom the soldiers were quartered. About 11:30, the bugles and bagpipes gave signal to prepare for battle. At the first sounds of the warlike instruments, the 5th Division flew to arms, and a little after midnight was drawn up in the Park and Place Royal in marching order. At 3:30, we moved out of Brussels by the Namur Gate and directed our march upon the enemy, followed by the Brunswick infantry. At 1, we halted on a height in rear of Genappe for a quarter of an hour, and then again advanced, and on descending the height, the thunder of the enemy's artillery was for the first time heard in the distance. And about 2:30, we arrived at Quatre-Bras, just in time to prevent that post falling into the hands of the enemy. Various circumstances conspired to render the defence of this post a measure of indispensable necessity. At the village, or rather large farmsteading of Quatre-Bras, the highway from Brussels to Charleroi is intersected by another, running from Nivelles, etc., to Saint-Amand and Ligny, where Father Blucher and his gallant children had just engaged in mortal combat with their inveterate enemies. To have tamely yielded up or abandoned this position, therefore, on the 16th, would have placed the whole of the Prussian army in a situation of great and imminent peril, for by doing so we would have left their extreme right so completely uncovered that, as soon as Ney saw us fairly out of the road, he would have carried his troops from Quatre-Bras to Saint-Amand in a couple of hours, and in the heat of the conflict with Napoleon attacked the right of Blucher with fatal effect. Of this there can be no doubt, and I conceive there can be as little, that had Marshal Ney been permitted to throw such a preponderating force into the scale against the Prussians on the afternoon of the 16th of June, they must have suffered a severe defeat. Their line of communication with us would, in all probability, have been cut off, the original plan of operations rendered abortive, and the Allied army placed in a perilous situation. That concludes the 15th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.